The first thing they took from me was not my water. It was my sense that the rules meant anything. I came home one afternoon to a silent irrigation pump, 60 cattle standing around empty troughs, and 200 acres of Montana grasslands slowly turning brown under the summer sun. 3 months later, the people who laughed and called me small time would be begging for a conversation. My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 42 years old, and I run a cattle ranch in the high plains outside Redstone Valley, Montana. Before I ever owned a ranch, before I ever spent my mornings checking fences and my evenings fixing equipment with dirt under my fingernails, I spent 13 years studying water systems and land records as a hydrology specialist, working with federal conservation projects. I knew rivers, I knew groundwater, and I knew something most people never bother to learn. Every piece of land in the West has a story buried underneath it. But none of that mattered the day I found my ranch running dry. I remember walking toward the irrigation controls thinking maybe it was just a broken valve or a power issue. I actually laughed to myself because I'd spent years dealing with complicated water problems, and I figured this would be an easy fix. Then I opened the control box, checked the system, and realized something was wrong. The equipment was fine. The water simply was not coming. At first, I thought there had been a mistake, maybe a paperwork issue. Maybe someone had accidentally changed a setting upstream. That kind of thing happens in rural areas. People know each other. Systems get old. And sometimes a phone call solves everything. So I called the local water district. The woman on the phone looked up my account and told me there had been a new diversion installed several miles upstream by a luxury housing project called Silver Ridge Estates. They had built a private water system to serve their new development, and according to her, everything had been approved. I asked who approved it. I asked to see the permits. I asked how they could redirect water that had supported my ranch for decades. She transferred me to the district supervisor, a man named Gary Caldwell, and I still remember the sound of his voice because it was not the voice of someone trying to solve a problem. It was the voice of someone who had already decided I was not important enough to listen to. "Ma'am, the project has permits," he said. "This is progress. You cannot expect a major development to stop because of one ranch." I told him I was not asking him to stop anything. I was asking him to explain why my legally established water access had disappeared overnight. There was a pause, and then he laughed. Not loudly, not like a movie villain, but worse. It was the kind of laugh someone gives when they believe they have already won. "Claire, with all due respect, you are looking at this like a hobby farmer. These developers are investing millions. Things move forward." Then he hung up while I was still talking. I stood there holding the phone, staring across my property, trying to understand how someone could dismiss a working ranch like it was just a decoration on a map. The frustrating part was that I knew people like Gary. They believed money created importance. They believed a new neighborhood with stone entrances and expensive houses mattered more than a ranch that had existed long before their first blueprint. But what they did not know was that I had spent years studying exactly these kinds of disputes. I knew that water fights in the West were never really just about water. They were about history, ownership, and the documents people assumed nobody would ever read. Over the next few weeks, the damage became impossible to ignore. My cattle started showing signs of stress. The grass fields that fed them began losing color. I paid thousands of dollars trying to keep things alive, hoping someone would finally step in and admit there had been a mistake. But nobody came. The water district stayed silent. Silver Ridge Estates kept building. And every time I drove past that construction site and saw luxury homes rising on the hill, I felt something changing inside me. I stopped feeling angry and started feeling curious, because I knew something they did not know. When people rush to build over old land, they usually look at what is visible. They look at the roads, the houses, the fences, the view. They rarely look deeper. They rarely ask what rights were attached to that ground 100 years ago. And that was their biggest mistake, because buried in those forgotten records was a piece of history that would change everything. For the next several days, I stopped trying to convince people who had already made up their minds. Instead, I went back to what I knew. I went back to the records. There is something almost forgotten about old land documents in the American West. Most people see them as dusty paperwork sitting in some archive, but to someone like me, they are closer to a family diary. Every signature, every transfer, every forgotten clause tells a story about who had the right to use that land and who never actually gave up their claim. I drove to the county records office with one goal in mind. I wanted to understand how Silver Ridge Estates had been approved so quickly and why nobody seemed concerned about the impact on the ranches below them. The clerk behind the counter recognized the development name immediately. "The big one on the hill?" she asked. I nodded. She smiled and said, "Everyone knows that project. They say it is going to change the whole valley." I remember thinking, maybe that was exactly the problem. Everyone knew what it was going to become, but nobody had stopped to ask what it was built on. I requested the original property records, the earliest land transfers, and any historical documents connected to the area. Hours turned into days. Days turned into weeks. My kitchen table became a mess of maps, old surveys, and handwritten notes. My coffee went cold more times than I can count because I would get so focused that I forgot it was even there. My friends joked that I was having a relationship with paperwork, but honestly, those documents were the only people who seemed willing to tell me the truth. Then I found something unusual. A reference from an 1887 land patent connected to the original parcel. At first, it looked like a simple historical note, but when I started tracing the chain of ownership, I noticed a pattern that did not make sense. The land had changed hands many times over the decades. Ranchers came and went. Developers bought sections of it. Parcels were divided and sold. But one thing kept appearing in the records: subsurface rights. Specifically, mineral rights connected to an old mining operation that had existed before the valley became what it was today. Most people do not understand how important that distinction is. In many parts of the West, owning the surface of the land does not always mean you own everything beneath it. The ground under your feet can have a completely separate legal history. And according to the documents I found, those mineral rights had never been properly transferred when the land was divided for future development. I sat back in my chair staring at the paperwork, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to destroy anyone, but because I finally understood why everything had happened so easily. They had looked at the land and only seen what they wanted to see. They saw expensive views, new homes, and potential profits. They never looked beneath the surface. I contacted a former colleague who specialized in federal land history, and after reviewing my findings, he became quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Claire, if these records are accurate, this is much bigger than a water dispute." Those words changed everything. I filed a formal request for review with the appropriate federal land authorities and submitted the historical documentation I had uncovered. I knew it would take time. Government investigations do not move like television shows. There are procedures, reviews, and people who need to verify every detail. But for the first time since my water disappeared, I felt like I was no longer fighting alone. Meanwhile, Silver Ridge Estates continued moving forward. Construction crews poured foundations. Trucks carried materials up the hill. The developers acted like nothing had happened. Then, one afternoon, I drove past the site and saw Gary Caldwell, the water district supervisor, standing near the entrance talking with one of the developers. He noticed me and walked over with that same confident expression he had during our phone call. "Still chasing paperwork?" he asked. I looked at him and said, "Funny thing about paperwork, Gary. Sometimes it remembers things people wish it forgot." He laughed. "You really think old documents are going to stop a project worth millions?" I looked past him at the houses being built on the hillside. "I think the truth does not care how expensive the houses are." He shook his head and walked away. At that moment, I knew they still did not understand. They thought I was fighting to get my water back. They thought this was about one rancher being difficult. They did not realize I had uncovered a problem that could affect every single home they had built. 2 months after I submitted the challenge, a federal inspection team arrived in Redstone Valley. I remember watching their vehicles drive up the road and feeling a strange mix of emotions: relief, nervousness, and honestly, a little fear. Because once the government starts digging into something this big, there is no going back. The inspectors spent days reviewing records, surveying boundaries, and comparing old documents with current property lines. They did not make dramatic announcements. They did not reveal everything immediately. They simply worked. And then came the meeting that changed the entire valley. Representatives from Silver Ridge Estates, county officials, and the water district gathered in a conference room. I sat quietly at the end of the table with my folders in front of me. The same kind of folders Gary had laughed at weeks earlier. The lead inspector cleared his throat and said, "Our review has confirmed significant issues regarding the transfer of subsurface rights associated with this development." The room went silent. The developer's attorney immediately started asking questions. Are you saying the homeowners do not own their properties? The inspector carefully explained that the situation required further legal action, but the rights connected to the land had never been properly resolved. For the first time, I watched people who had always spoken with confidence suddenly become uncertain. The same people who told me progress does not wait for small ranchers were now asking whether their own million-dollar project was standing on legally unstable ground. But the biggest surprise was still waiting, because while everyone was focused on the development itself, I was still searching through history, and that search would lead me to a woman nobody expected to be connected to the story. Someone who had no idea her family might still hold the key to everything underneath Silver Ridge Estates. The woman I found was named Evelyn Hart, and honestly, when I first saw her name in those old records, I expected to find someone connected to the past in a much bigger way. Maybe a retired business owner, maybe someone who knew exactly what they had. Instead, I found an 87-year-old woman living a quiet life outside Helena, Montana, in a small home with a garden full of wildflowers and a porch covered with old wooden chairs. She had spent most of her life as a school librarian. She loved history, but she never imagined that her own family history would one day become the center of a legal battle involving a multi-million-dollar development. When I called her for the first time, she was polite but confused. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I think you may have the wrong person." And honestly, I understood why she thought that. Imagine receiving a phone call from a stranger telling you that an old family connection from nearly a century ago might still matter. It sounds like the kind of thing that belongs in a movie, not in a normal afternoon phone conversation. But the records were real. The names were real. And the history underneath Silver Ridge Estates had never actually disappeared. It had just been forgotten. I spent hours talking with Evelyn, listening to stories about her grandfather and the mining operation he had once helped build. She told me her family had always kept a few old documents in a wooden box, but nobody had ever thought they were valuable. They were just memories, pieces of paper from another time. Her grandfather had believed the land would always be part of the family story. But as years passed, the company faded. People moved away, and eventually everyone assumed that chapter was closed forever. Except it was not closed. Not legally. With Evelyn's permission, we began gathering everything we could find. Old company records, family documents, historical surveys, letters that had been sitting untouched for decades. And the more we uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The original mining company had dissolved, but certain rights connected to the land had never been properly resolved. They were buried beneath years of property transfers, development plans, and assumptions that nobody would ever challenge them. That was the part that amazed me the most. The entire luxury community had been built because people assumed nobody would ever look backward. They were focused on the future, on selling homes, increasing property values, and creating the image of a perfect mountain community. But they forgot that the past does not vanish just because people stop reading about it. After the legal process moved forward, Evelyn's claim was recognized, and suddenly the person everyone had overlooked became the most important person connected to the entire development. I remember sitting with her after the news came out. She was not celebrating in the way people might expect. She was not angry. She was not talking about revenge. She just looked at the documents in front of her and quietly said, "My whole life, I thought these papers were just something my grandfather left behind. I never knew they were still part of the story." That sentence stayed with me because it captured everything about what happened. Nobody involved expected history to come back. The developers did not. The water district did not. Even Evelyn did not. But it did. Eventually, the developers had no choice but to negotiate. The same people who once acted like a rancher's concerns were an inconvenience were now sitting at a table trying to solve a problem that could not be ignored. They reached an agreement with Evelyn, purchasing the rights connected to the property for a significant amount that gave her financial security and allowed the development to continue through a new legal arrangement. For Evelyn, it was life-changing. For me, it was a reminder that knowledge has value. The research I did, the years I spent studying land and water systems, the boring details most people skip over, those were the exact things that made the difference. I was never the richest person in the room. I never had the biggest company behind me. I never had a team of expensive lawyers waiting to fight my battles. I had experience, patience, and the willingness to keep digging when everyone else told me to stop. The compensation I received helped me rebuild my ranch the way I always wanted. I installed a completely independent water system, one that did not depend on a district office or someone else's approval. The first morning I turned on that new system, I stood there listening to the sound of water moving through the pipes, and I realized something. For 3 months, I had been fighting just to get back what was taken from me. But in the end, I gained something more important: independence. A few weeks later, I drove past Silver Ridge Estates again. The same entrance that once represented power and confidence looked completely different. The construction signs were still there, but the excitement had faded. Lawyers came and went. Surveyors walked the property. People who once talked about unstoppable growth were suddenly talking about paperwork and responsibility. And I will say this clearly: I never blame the families who bought homes there. Most of them had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. They trusted the people who sold them those properties. They believed everything had been checked. They believed the experts had done their jobs. They were not the people I was fighting. The problem was the attitude that started everything. The belief that if you had enough money, you could move faster than the truth. That if you built something big enough, nobody would question what was underneath. That if someone was smaller, their concerns could simply be ignored. And that is the lesson I took from all of this. Real justice is not about watching someone lose. It is about making sure people are forced to answer for the choices they make. Because land is not just land. Water is not just water. And old records are not just old records. They are pieces of promises made by people who came before us. When those promises are ignored, eventually someone has to bring them back into the light. Looking back, the funniest part is that the people who underestimated me actually gave me the reason to keep fighting. Every time someone told me I was too small, every time someone treated my ranch like it was less important than a luxury neighborhood, they reminded me why I could not walk away. They thought they were dealing with a rancher who was angry about losing water. They did not realize they were dealing with someone who had spent years learning exactly how these systems worked. They thought the story was about one small ranch. It turned out to be about something much bigger. It was about whether ordinary people still have the power to challenge decisions made by people with more money, more influence, and more resources. So now I want to hear what you think. Was what happened at Silver Ridge Estates a case of justice finally catching up? Or did too many innocent people get caught in a battle they never started? Do you think companies and developers should be held responsible when they move forward without fully understanding the history behind the land they are using? And have you ever seen someone underestimated simply because they did not look powerful on the outside? Leave your thoughts below, because these conversations matter. Sometimes the person standing alone is the person who knows the truth. If you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who believes ordinary people deserve a fair chance. And subscribe for more stories where forgotten details, hidden history, and one person's determination can completely change the outcome.